Tuesday, March the 30th, and you're watching GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism here at the Hoover Institution. I'll be the moderator of today's show. That means I have the pleasure of introducing three of my colleagues, three Hoover Institution senior fellows, who we jokingly refer to as GoodFellows. In case you're wondering about the movie crossover, that's GoodFellas. These are GoodFellows. And our first good fellow is John Cochrane. John is an economist and the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hello, John. How are you today?
I'm great. Great to see you, Bari.
Our second good fellow, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fawad Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow. He is also the author of the best-selling book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. Hello, H.R.
Hey, Bill. It's great to be with you, John, Neil, and our special guest,
who we'll get to in a second. And our third good fellow, before we get to our guest, is our colleague Niall Ferguson, who is the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Neil's, of course, a renowned historian and author. He has a book coming out. Neil, I think it is 5 weeks from today. May the 4th is the release. You still have time to go pre-order, folks. The title of that book, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. Speaking of catastrophe, Neil, it looks like you've abandoned the wilderness outpost or been relieved of duty. Are you closer to home now?
Indeed, I'm back and clean shaven with it. So it's a delight to be back where I belong, and even more of a delight to see Bari Weiss as our guest.
Yes, so Neil just gave it away. Our guest today is Bari Weiss. In case you don't know who Bari Weiss is, she is a journalist and an author. She actually has a newsletter on Substack called Common Sense with Bari Weiss. Here's why Bari Weiss is on our show today, in which we're going to talk about cancel culture. And on a Tuesday in July 2020, Bari Weiss posted a resignation letter in which she called out the New York Times for fostering a culture of bullying by those who dare engage what she calls wrongthink. Bari was at the time working at the Times as an opinion section writer and editor, but she quit that very prestigious job. So today we're going to talk about what prompted Bari to write that letter, what is going on with cancel culture and the mindset that's taken over America's most influential media outlets, most elite prep universities, and how one can get by in the workplace today, daring to think differently. So Bari, welcome to GoodFellows.
Thank you. Happy to be an honorary Goodfellow for the day, for the hour.
Yes, you'll get a swag bag at the end of the show. So let's begin, Bari. Again, I know my three colleagues are just dying to get into this with you. I'd like to read you something that you wrote for the New York Post back in January, and I think it's a good way to start this conversation. Here's what you said, quote, "By any measure, we have achieved incredible progress and enjoy extraordinary freedoms, and yet people aren't acting that way. They are acting increasingly like subjects in a totalitarian country. These people write to me daily. They admit to regularly censoring themselves at work and with friends, succumbing to social pressure to tweet the right hashtag, to parroting slogans they do not believe to protect their livelihoods, like the greengrocer in Václav Havel's famous essay, The Power of the Powerless." You added, quote, "These people aren't crazy. They are scared for good reason." Bari, why are these people scared, and how did we get to this point?
Well, phenomenon that we think of, or at least that I had always thought about, as being contained to totalitarian countries, phenomenon that like doublethink and dissidence are increasingly applicable to the home of the free, which is a very, very strange phenomenon, because by all measures, like you said before, we live in a liberal democracy, and yet people are acting as if there is something like a gulag here. There is no gulag, but people are acting that way. And the reason for that, I think, is largely because of the machine and the technology that we're using to talk to each other right now. I can go on social media and misconstrue anything, a phrase, 3 seconds of video that one of you says in this conversation, and potentially, if the right number of blue check marks pick up on it, ruin your life. And so, given the fact that we live in the era of the cloud, the information that we put out into the world, everything about us is recorded, into eternity. Every mistake that we make, every small misstep, every error in our speech is recorded forever. There's no such thing as moving to a new town. It follows you wherever you go. And so when we see, and some of these examples are celebrities, but some of them are just normal people, when you see an actress fired from her, having her career totally derailed for sharing a politically incorrect meme, when you see a 16-year-old, or I guess she was 17, have her college admissions to the University of Tennessee rescinded because of a TikTok video, a 3-second TikTok video she put out several years prior that her classmate held on to, almost in a vengeful way, in order to release it at exactly the right moment when he knew it would have the most grievous impact on her life. When you see enough of those examples, and we could go on for hours with the examples that I have in my back pocket, that sends a very powerful message to everyone else, which is conform and obey to this new ideology that calls itself social justice, but is in fact incredibly illiberal. And so not only do you have people censoring themselves for the mores of the present, you have people preemptively censoring themselves for jokes or figures of speech that they anticipate will be unacceptable 6 months or a year or several years from now. So that is the phenomenon that I think we're living in. I think people wrongly understand this. People hear the phrase, I think, cancel culture, and they think, it's a little frivolous. It's a little bit of crazy people. It's 1 or 2 fringe characters online. No, these are examples of what I think of as a kind of American version of a cultural revolution. It's not coming from Mao to the Red Guards and, flowing its way down, but that doesn't mean that it's not incredibly powerful and it's not exerting a tremendous impact on the individual choices of people in their lives, but also, I would say, on the choices that are being made by the very institutions that are supposed to be charged with upholding the liberal order in America.
Could I ask you on that? So you pointed to information, which is true now, but we've had outbreaks of this sort of thing before. So I'm not sure that the information as opposed to the what we choose to do with it is the central culprit. After all, widespread information ought to let one quickly set a record straight, which was impossible back in the old days. Instead, it is what you point to is it is almost a political / religious movement. What's interesting about it compared to, say, the Bolsheviks, the Maoists, and so forth, is that it is seems more on the religious end than the political end, because there are, for the moment, no leaders and very little of a program of what they will do when they actually take power. But we've seen the Great Awakenings, we've seen the Protestant Reformation, which turned political and violent. We've seen witch trials where the quickest way to not be accused of being a witch is to accuse someone else of being a witch. A lot of that phenomenon has happened before, along with the very much, there's a lot of guilty rich people who are looking for a reason to expiate their guilt, and denouncing their neighbor seems to be a good way to do it. Parenthetically, it's kind of funny that these are all the products of years of anti-bullying training, who have perhaps turned that into a how-to manual that the rest of us didn't really.
Well, bullying is wrong unless you're bullying the right people, in which case it's very, very right.
Right.
I wonder, Barry, is just to pick up where John left off. He kind of went marching into my territory there, straight into the history, just taking all my lines away. But is this the
say it better.
Is this the Great Awakening? Should we think of this as part of an American tradition of religion? This is just a secular iteration of it. You mentioned the Cultural Revolution in China, and you made the really important point, which I completely agree with, that this is bottom up rather than top down. Or rather, it emanates from certain institutions. I remember Andrew Sullivan saying a few years ago, we all live on campus now. Would it be fair to say that the Great Awakening, this quasi-religious, quasi-cultural revolution, originated at the universities?
I would say absolutely yes. And other people who are way more well-versed than me in Foucault and Gramsci and post-structuralism and Marxism could explain that better to you. What I would say is that it's very clear that the nucleation point for this ideology were the universities, and originally kind of the fringe departments of the universities. And the old consensus, you could ask a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal, a conservative, they would all tell you the same thing up until extremely recently. And that was, it's campus nonsense. as these gender studies majors at Oberlin, or, an anthropology major at Columbia, where I graduated 15 years ago, and this was already very much the dominant mode back then, which, just imagine where it's gone since then, that they would get their job at, in corporate America, or in a tech company in Silicon Valley, or at a place like the New York Times. And they would leave the kind of radical excesses of campus ideology behind them, and they would come to be shaped by in the mold of the institution. But the opposite, as people like Yuval Levin have noted, has happened. What's actually happened is that these institutions have been transformed by the people who were marinating in deeply illiberal ideas. And so I guess the good news and the bad news is that ideas really matter. It actually very much matters what you learn and what you're exposed to as a young person, and especially in the formative years of college. So in a way, Neil, you're right. It has been bottom up, in the sense that the pressure was originally coming from these younger people. But what's really strange is that the people that ought to have the authority inside these institutions, who are charged with upholding the values of the institutions, are folding like a tent in front of this thing. And that's the really interesting question. I think sometimes we forget that there are adults in the room, or ostensible adults in the room, who theoretically have the power to turn this off, have the power to say, no, I'm not actually going to, keep the new editor of Teen Vogue, a 27-year-old, from assuming her position because as a 16-year-old, she put out homophobic and bigoted anti-Asian tweets that she's already apologized for. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give in to your protests, the other 20 people that protested. And if you feel uncomfortable by her being in charge of the magazine, you're free to walk out the door. Same situation with Tom Cotton at the New York Times, same situation with hundreds of other examples that we could cycle through right now, but it's all the same story. And the story is that the people that are in charge utterly lack a sense of moral authority and really of courage to stand up in the face of this movement. And that, to me, is the more interesting question than why are there true believers? Because I understand, I think, more readily the impulses of the true believers who are desperate for a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of being on the right side of history, a sense of having a good cause to fight for. Mm-hmm. What is harder for me to understand are the people that are enabling the march of this new religion.
HR, I had a question for you. I was going to segue to you in a way that might help. I used to say there was a problem of political skew. That's to say the ratio of liberals to conservatives, or Democrats to Republicans, in nearly every institution except the American military academies, colleges, West Point, etc. And that at least those institutions hadn't yet been captured. But I don't know if this is true anymore. And one has a sense that the great capitulation that Bari just alluded to, where the people in authority just roll over under pressure from the woke red guards, even in the military, this is starting to happen. What's your take there?
Well, I would just say it can't happen in the military, because if the military adopts this ideology, that they will no longer be combat effective, right? There are units that fight together as teams are bound together by a covenant with one another that is based on principles, values like self-sacrifice and honor, the achievement of an aim that they're willing to sacrifice for. And so this kind of identity politics and this tendency to regard people as victims, as kind of the new form of heroism, has no place, right, in the military. And what I was going to ask Bari is as I look at this problem set, I see that there's a tendency to portray victimhood as the new heroism. And I think you called identity politics the Olympics of victimhood in your excellent book, which I really enjoyed reading, Bari, on how to fight anti-Semitism. What I like about your essays is that you actually are trying to tell people, hey, you have agency. You have influence over your future. You don't have to just be a victim. And I think that what we see these days is that our younger generation is being taught that victimhood is the new heroism, and that victimhood is how they can achieve virtue, and instead of accomplishing and overcoming obstacles that are put in their way.
Thank you so much. I think that it's not true everywhere, but it's certainly true in elite America that victimhood or claiming victimhood or weaponizing victimhood is the quickest pathway to power. And I think there's every incentive for people right now, at least in elite American institutions, to claim it and claim it as many rungs in the victimhood ladder as they can possibly grasp, because they know that that gives them moral and epistemological authority. That is what is so perverse about this ideology. It doesn't believe that anyone can that anyone is equally capable of grasping truths. It believes that who you are, literally your immutable characteristics, the circumstances of your birth, determine how much truth claim you have in the world. It determines how much your voice matters. And that to me is totalitarian. It is illiberal. And, I don't believe that the solution to past historical wrongs is to take the old, let's call it the old caste system, and flip it on its head and replace it with a new one. I believe that the historical remedy to that kind of evil mindset, evil worldview, is to say, no, we reject any worldview that constrains people to the lane of their birth, and that insists that we judge people by the sins of their father or by the color of their skin. That is always wrong, no matter who is selling it.
And Barry, this is why this is such a danger to the military if it were to infect the military, right?
But hold on, HR, hasn't it infected the military? We're talking about like it hasn't happened.
Well, I would like to believe that it hasn't happened within military units where people are bound together really by their common commitment to one another, by mutual respect and common purpose. And they're in an infantry platoon or a scout platoon or a tank platoon. There is no room for people who identify based on their identity category, right? You were there as American soldiers who are committed to one another and committed to the mission. And any kind of reversion to this, to this identity category is by definition, cuts against the cohesion of that military unit. So I do think, though, popular culture, Barry, cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos. I think that there are many, and this is why it's a danger to the military, because our military is and should be responsive to civilian authority. I think that there are many civilians these days who don't understand that warrior ethos. Mm-hmm. And of course, even I think because of this tendency to see victimhood as new heroism, I think that is why our warriors are often seen as hapless recipients of a fate that's already predetermined, rather than those who exercise really control over their fate through their military prowess, their battlefield prowess. We never really celebrate victories on the battlefield these days. We only really report on casualties suffered. This is why I think some people portray veterans, right, as traumatized, fragile human beings. And so I am concerned about how popular culture is portraying military service and veterans. And I think military leaders have to be really particularly sensitive these days to ensuring that that our units aren't infected by this kind of.
So I want to challenge both of these views, and I think it's the military is in more danger than you think, and I think it has moved from a bottom up to a top down. Let's think about what we've said. What we've said is that this idea has now infected all of the institutions of civil society, nonprofits, media, government agencies, all the alphabet soup, NGOs, all of philanthropy is just completely taken over. It's a view that is very small among the electorate, but once you've got all the institutions of civil society, you have power. And now it's got the federal government. We already have 2 executive orders commanding equity, inclusion, social justice, and climate through every action of the federal government. In the military is in the end run by civilians who will tell the military what to do. And it's, I think, a symptom. I'm an economist. HR said, the Army has to be ready, has to meet that test on the battlefield. Well, we don't fight wars that often. And many armies through history have grown complacent and ineffective because they don't face the competitive test. Our institutions it's not the competitive institutions, it's the not so competitive institutions that are able to indulge in this sort of thing, and the government being number one. So I think it is in the process of becoming top down, and that is the point. Take power and shove it down the rest of our throats. Because the thing we didn't mention at the universities, lots of strange ideas grow up in universities. What's new about this is not the ideas themselves, but the idea of silencing others. That's the effective part. It's not whatever crazy stuff they say. And it's what you didn't learn in college and are no longer allowed to learn in college that is in fact the dangerous part of it. And then you get to your institutions and nobody knows anything anymore. I'd also challenge that that this is just a failure of nerve on the upper ranks. The upper ranks seem to be all in for it too. Why? Because they want to get the invited to Davos. They want to get the pleasure of being toasted at the philanthropic club. I look at the upper reaches of the Federal Reserve and the NGOs that I study. They're all jumping into climate change, social justice, and it's not. They're the Woodstock generation. So I don't think there's a desire to push back that doesn't have a spine.
I think fear is a much bigger part of this than you implied, John.
Okay, I'll go with that.
I don't think the people in positions of authority at universities are themselves terribly woke. Most of them are old school liberals who kind of had a free speech default position. But what happens in a cultural revolution or Great Awokening is it begins with the no platformings. It begins with the cancellations, the disinvitations, and it gradually escalates. They begin with the conservatives. They begin with the people who are quote unquote controversial. And this is happened in a relatively short time frame. True, the left was already a phenomenon, a force in universities decades ago. It was a topic of conversation in the 60s. But it wasn't until really quite recently that the academic left became profoundly illiberal in the sense that it began to police speech and to cancel invitations, rescind invitations, protest against honorary degrees. I remember when my wife, whom Bari knows well, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, was disinvited, having been invited to speak at the commencement at Brandeis University. That was in 2014.
Yeah, wow.
It was then that I realized what was going to happen, that they would begin with petitions and calls for disinvitation, and the university top brass would fold out of cowardice. The most powerful force in human history is not courage, HR. Sadly, it's a minority pursuit. The most powerful force in human history is total cowardice. Now, most revolutions are famously supposed to eat their own children. That's an old and familiar phrase. But this revolution's quite interesting because it eats its own parents. The liberals who hired the woke, the people who appointed and gave tenure to clearly illiberal ideologues, are now being devoured, or are so afraid of being devoured by this younger generation that they will capitulate at almost the first shot of the first petition, the first email. They fold.
And I think that there are two things that you need in order to be able to stand up to this. One, and you lose most people with this, you have to be willing to be called a racist, which is the gravest of all sins in our culture and evil. And you have to be willing to be called it in order to stand up to this ideology. You also have to be willing to argue for inequality of outcome. You have to be willing to argue that inequality of outcome is not necessarily the logical outgrowth of systemic bigotry, which is the other pillar of this ideology. With that, you've already lost a huge majority of people. I mean, you have a few courageous people you have a lot of cowards, and then you just have a lot of conformists. John, when you were talking before about the people in charge who seem all in for it, there is a major chasm often, I find, in that class between the things they are learning from their assistants to post on Twitter and the things they actually say in the privacy around their dining room table with a few guests. Oftentimes, these people are like the greengrocer in the essay, fronting as true believers because they think that that's the only way that they can hang on to their job, or they've convinced themselves that that's the kind of price you need to pay in order to negotiate with this thing, in order to kind of rein it in. And I would just say that from watching all the examples over the past few years, which are too many to count, it's very clear to me that this is not an ideology that can really be reasoned with, because as has been discussed in the past few minutes, it does really function more like a religion that casts out anyone who's a heretic, that casts out anyone who doesn't agree with every tenet, and the tenets keep growing. If you look at me and you look at my life and the way I live my life and my personal choices and my identity, I'm exactly someone that should be, a member in good standing of the progressive left. But because I don't fit and agree with every single aspect of this thing, it was kind of impossible for me to continue working in an institution that has very clearly been captured by this new religion or this new ideology.
I want to say, I think both of you are right. If you think about, what I've been looking at lately, if you're a central banker and you want to get ahead, do you work on marking to market swaps contracts, or do you go give climate and social justice talks? It's clear what you choose to do. And I think that principle of self-interested choice of language goes anywhere. But I want to take up what you said, Bari, earlier on inequality, because I want you to help us get in the heads of our young woke millennials. What do they want? Where is it going? Is there anything coherent here? One thing I notice is that the goals are inherently unmeasurable. Distribution of income is one that you can almost sort of think about measuring, but you posed it right. So what's inequality might be more, but what's the right amount of inequality? Is society systemically racist and unjust until we all report exactly the same number on the bottom line of our 1040 form? The various kinds of justices, how do you know when you've got there? Is there a goal here other than just sort of, we want to take power and tell the rest of you what to do? But then I can't see there's any end, when yes, maybe capitalism is bad. So what do you guys want instead? We've tried some socialisms. Those didn't work out too well. It sort of looks like crony capitalism with high taxes, lots of benefits, and lots of consulting contracts for woke people is where we go. But I asked it a lot of ways to sort of open up the question. Is this a program, or is this just opiate for the upper classes that will always be the rallying cry for put us in power and get rid of the people we don't like?
Mm-hmm. I mean, listen, I think that in order to understand it, in order to get in the head of people who are the true believers, it's important to understand their experience of American capitalism, which has not been great. Wait,
these are the kids of well-off people who go to fancy colleges and are shoehorned into jobs at the New York Times. This is an upper class phenomenon. The kids I know who live out in Fresno in the Central Valley and work as firefighters are not one bit woke.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the right way to frame it would be, these are kids who have grown up on the internet, mm-hmm. who don't, by and large, don't go to a synagogue, a mosque, or a church.
Yes.
Who don't have a sense of community or meaning, who, aren't having sex, which is a really fascinating topic for another podcast, whose experience of life is all mitigated through a glass rectangle in their pocket, and who, even as they are, you're right, John, the products of the supposed meritocracy, I think, increasingly see through its hypocrisies. So, that is you have to understand, in order to defeat this, we need to understand what is drawing people toward it. What is drawing?
There's an argument there's an argument, isn't there, that precisely the appeal of cultural wars the shift to identity politics and away from economics is that actually you don't end up significantly altering the distribution of wealth and income at all, because the left lost the economic argument back in the day in the 1980s, lost it totally. And now what I see happening, and I think it took a while to take shape, is a shift into an entirely new landscape of culture. And one of the reasons that major corporations and indeed very wealthy people, even billionaires, are prepared to go along with this is that they know that actually this is an easier revolution to ride out than a revolution that genuinely aimed at redistributing the means of production. Right. And I think that's why corporate America is like, sure, ESG, let's sign up for virtue signaling, yes, and let's let these people into the human resources department. What could possibly go wrong? Because they think that this is actually preferable to real socialism of the Bernie Sanders vintage. I think this is a terrible mistake, mind you, but I think that's how they think.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect smokescreen for the Sun Valley Aspen class of people. What they wrongly what they wrongly seem to, what they are unable to see is, Neil, you're exactly right. Let these people in, give them a job. They don't understand that they're literally letting the wolves into the henhouse, and that soon after they make that decision, some of those people call me up and say, wait, hold on, like help me understand what exactly this ideology is about, because it claims to be about all of these things that, and all of these values that I've lived my whole life by, like anti-racism, like social justice, like progressivism. But then why am I scared of making a joke and losing the company that I've built myself?
And the goal is also, this is a key question going back to John's, what do they want? There is a goal, I think, and one hears this often in universities and now in professions, of representation of all minorities in proportion to their share in the population. And so that's one of the measurable goals that I see being set. Example of where we are. A friend calls up the other day, a professional, not an academic, and says, there's a campaign underway in my profession to create targets that amount to quotas for Blacks in the profession. And I'm on a large call with a good many other participants, and nobody except me is willing to object to this as a goal. What should I do? Should I write a piece about this? And I said, do not do that. Do not, under any circumstances, be that one person, particularly not that one white guy, that fixes his bayonet and jumps out the trench and runs towards the other side, because at some point you'll look behind you and find yourself completely alone. I think that is a goal that is implicit in much that's being argued for. And in the end, it amounts to a systematic discrimination. Anti-racism, you've used the phrase a couple of times, the term a couple of times, turns out to be, let's now discriminate against the others in the way that previously we discriminated against African Americans, for example. And so we end up in a territory which is, to me, kind of topsy-turvy. The notion of equality before the law is thrown aside, and we end up in a new and systematic form of discrimination. It's just with the sign reversed. And it even gets crazier than that. In the newspaper you used to work for, the New York Times, they were running just in the last couple of years, opinion pieces that appeared to be in favor of segregation, with headlines like, should I let my Black child play with white kids? You see segregation happening at some educational institutions. Brett Weinstein ended up being run off the campus at Evergreen because he was opposed to a no whites on campus day. So I do think there are measurable goals. It's just that they're, to my mind, really objectionable goals.
Yeah, I would just draw a distinction, I guess, between, just as there's good identity politics and bad identity politics, there's good anti-racism and there's bad anti-racism. The problem right now is the only mode of anti-racism that is not the only, but the very dominant mode in American culture right now is the bad Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo critical race theory version of anti-racism. There's another version of anti-racism that is, summarized by, King's idea that we should judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. That is also anti-racism. It is anti-racist, good anti-racist to say race is a social construct used by racists. And we should try and get to a point where the idea of race is increasingly not relied on, rather than buying into social policies or ideas that reify this social construct. All of the people that, if we had a healthier culture and a more normal media environment, would be far bigger celebrities than Ibram Kendi.
I also think Neil's mistaking here a little bit a goal of the movement with a bad use of superficial statistics. Yes, it's often tossed out, there's only 12.6% African Americans and white in something, or usually 1.6, and we need to bring the numbers up. But that's not the fundamental goal. The fundamental goal is to be in charge of who hires and who gets what. Because as that goal, we all will soon recognize it's impossible. Economics right now is devoted to academia. Everybody has to hire, we're supposed to only hire Blacks until they get up to, I think it's, 13%, the same ratio of the population. That's clearly impossible. Why? Because the schools are terrible. The public schools are terrible, and they don't get into college. There's just not enough qualified, even vaguely qualified candidates. So that goal will fall by the wayside. But it's just, that's a bad use of statistics, because, one is not, it's perfectly obvious that an institution is not racist if it is doing absolutely everything it can to let in at that stage whoever's available. There is something to systemic racism. It's in the public schools, but there's nothing that Stanford University can do about that in its hiring, and it will have to face that fact. I think we're all about to face that now as universities. Once the musical chairs stop and all the available Black graduate students have been hired, everybody else will need someone to teach their classes. So it's a talking point. It's not really a deep goal, I think, of the movement. The goal of the movement is to take power and keep it and force it down the rest of our throats. Although then to what end? Well, utopian revolutions have always had a little bit of a trouble of exactly what is the utopia going to look like once we're in charge and tell everybody else what to do.
Can I just go back to one thing Neil was saying before? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
The advice to the friend, the advice to the anonymous friend. I guess I'm surprised by the advice. Not that you're wrong about the fact that he would be sort of alone against the crowd and would be smeared and all those things would happen to him. But I think we need to be realistic about the fact that if we want to defeat this movement, people are going to have to start standing up against it.
Right. But the key thing I learned over the last few years is that doing that on your own is just a kamikaze mission. And what we need to do, and this is something you should talk about, Bari, is actually be a little bit more organized and also recognize that this is not going to be won on the battlefield of argument, on the battlefield of reason and evidence, because at the core of wokeism is a rejection of the mode of argument in which one might have a debate in which evidence would be marshaled and arguments made. The key to this kind of warfare is that it is all about character destruction and questioning the good faith of the person who objects. And so anybody who thinks that they're going to stand up and have a good argument about the rights and wrongs of positive discrimination, affirmative action, or you name it, they're not going to have that argument. They're simply going to have their character destroyed. And so you can't simply be that heroic person who jumps out of the trench and runs at the machine guns unless you want to be destroyed. What's the lesson I've learned from this? Well, at some level, the power grab has happened because of a very powerful network of like-minded people who, as John says, realized that there was actually a way to take over institutions, beginning with certain academic departments, and through appointments and promotions, gradually to take control. We who have stood on the other side and argued for the principles of the Enlightenment of individual identity, not a collective identity, of equality before the law, not equity, whatever that means. We've actually been playing the wrong game. We didn't even take a knife to a gunfight. We went with a pea shooter or maybe some kind of catapult. We needed to organize in a comparable way. And I think this is your cue, Bari, to talk about FAIR and what the significance of FAIR is. And maybe I can say a bit of a word. I'll say a word about AFA after you say a word.
Let me chime in. We need to rebuild alternative institutions of civil society. As an economist, competition is the salve for all goods. And in some sense, the root of this is not enough competition. It's hard to rebuild new institutions, but when the New York Times is failing, we have to rebuild Substack, or you need defense against the crowd in institutions that will stand up and help you to get your word out and defend yourself. And now on to the ones you have going here.
So one of the things that we launched, I guess it's now 3 weeks ago, and it came together very, very quickly, is an organization called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And this is meant to pick up the flag that the ACLU and the SPLC put down long ago by fighting for fairness, by fighting for equality, by standing up for good anti-racism and for educating the public, which frankly is often very confused, understandably, by this ideology because of the way it presents itself. And so people listening, I hope, will go to check out fairforall.org and check out the board. I think it's kind of a model of the kind of institutions we need to be building. It's the first of hopefully many. Right now we're really, really focused on empowering parents to stand up against this ideology in their kids' schools. And it's not just the elite schools, it's public schools all over the country. And we're organizing parent chapters all over the country right now to help empower them and have them stand up for their kids. So that's one thing we're doing. The other thing we're doing is choosing lawsuits carefully and getting behind certain suits that we think could be precedent setting. And we also hope to be making videos and really educating the public to explain to them what this ideology is really about when you look beyond the hashtag and the slogan. FAIR is great. I hope Niall will talk about the similar organization that's happening inside the academy, but these are only the very, very beginnings. The thing that I believe that I will be doing for the rest of my lifetime, and that I think anyone who's concerned about this needs to be doing, is focusing on building new institutions, new organizations, in my case, new media, but in someone else's case, it might mean a new university. 3 years ago, when I walked into the New York Times, I knew it was biased. I was never going to be invited to sit at the popular kids table for various reasons. But I really was of the mindset that it could be reformed from within. I have to say that I've been disabused of that strategy. I just don't think it works in many of these cases that have been sort of decayed beyond repair. Some institutions, maybe the University of Chicago, St. John's, I can think of ones that can be shored up. But in general, I think the attitude of those of us who are concerned by what's going on is not, yay, we managed to smuggle through one good op-ed every 6 months. No, it's let's start a new op-ed page.
And before we talk about the future of journalism, which I very much think we should, a brief word about the Academic Freedom Alliance. A few years ago, I wrote a piece saying that we needed NATO for professors, with an Article 5 stating that an attack on one was an attack on all. In other words, some kind of concerted defense strategy, preferably with a deterrent effect. That now exists, thanks to Robbie George at Princeton and others. The AFA, Academic Freedom Alliance, exists to protect professors when they come under attack, so that you're not twisting in the wind on your own. And I'm beginning to see the first signs that this organization and others, FIRE is another good example, Heterodox Academy is a third. These organizations are showing that we do actually have some defensive and deterrent capability. And I think this is going to be in the courts ultimately that it gets decided. That is to say, it's only when organizations suffer significant loss as a result of woke policies, that the tide's going to turn. And the case just reported, interestingly, on CNN of a professor whose case was upheld after he had essentially been cancelled for not going along with the preferred pronouns rigmarole at his university. I think that the potential to use lawfare, to use organization and litigation to push back is real, but we're just at the beginning of this journey. Anyway, that's enough of an ad for AFA.
We should be able to have new, like universities. It's even harder than media. When universities are failing, which they are not teaching our children basic things that they need to learn. New universities should spring up, and that we have to sue and push the current universities to reform it's a sign of how non-competitive the university business is. Bari wrote beautifully about this in your Harvard Westlake piece, that we seem to be this stratified society where getting ahead in America means you need to go to one of the top 10 universities, and that means you need to do whatever it takes to learn to speak that language. But it does seem media is more amenable to competition, that new things are coming up. So I don't know whether you want to talk about new universities or new media.
Well, it's new everything. If I had to go back, and the advice that I give to younger people is the extent to which there still is local journalism and it's possible for you to actually go out and report, which is the number one skill that I think young journalists should be learning how to use, learning to acquire. Go do that. If you're interested in climbing the ladder and introducing yourself as X from the New York Times, and that's the most important value to you, by all means, start writing woke things at the age of 16. Never stop, don't stop, never stopping until you walk into those doors of the old grade lady. And if you keep doing that for a while, you'll probably have good job security. That's not why I went into journalism. I went into journalism because it's a profession that rewards curiosity. And at the New York Times, curiosity was quite literally a liability. You really, you can't be curious about certain subjects, or it means you kind of get waved off. And then the more insidious thing that happens is that you start waving yourself off of those topics. And when I started to feel myself doing that, I was like, this is not why I went into this profession. If I want to, just write copy, mindlessly, I can make a lot more money doing it if I start a PR company. Let's be honest.
Is the Times doing what it's doing because it wants to or because it has to? My impression of the Times is that this is what it has to do in the current economic situation. You can't support yourself by advertising from large companies who want you to have a really good reputation, because your reputation varies off them. Then you have to hit the paywall. And the kind of people who are willing to pay are the kind of ones who seem to want what the New York Times offers. And the minute Bret Stephens writes something they don't like, they'll say, I'm canceling my subscription. So how does media pay for itself when advertising by large corporations who want you to be sensible fails?
Right. That's the $1 billion question. If you look at the surveys of the New York Times readership, it's something like 92 or 95% identifies as liberal. Now, there's a huge difference.
There's a chicken and egg there too, but yes.
Huge difference also between what liberal means to someone like my grandmother, who's 83 years old and or 85 and has subscribed to the New York Times for her entire life.
Yep. Now,
strangely, she's kind of an experiment for me to watch. She's being radicalized by the paper now. And the younger liberals who are on Twitter and, causing a, absolute shitstorm every time the paper does something that they don't like. So I think that there's a little bit of pandering to that younger, very, very loud group, and the sense that, wait, if we want this model to continue for the younger generation and we actually want to convert Twitter outrage into paid subscribers, we have to listen to these people and give them what they want. The question in journalism right now is, we obviously know from every single study that's been done about social media that outrage sells and outrage keeps people engaged. Right. So the question is there a model for journalism that is not built on monetizing human beings' outrage and polarizing people and making us hate one another? I really hope so.
Yeah, I think there is. And Barry, what I'd like to hear is what is your assessment of the degree to which the younger generation is projecting, critical race theory, for example, and all various forms of bigotry and racism. And I mean, racism in the way that you have described it and working against it in a rational way. Because if you think about it, what they're being told is that you should be judged by your identity category, not by the content of your character, as Martin Luther King said that we ought to be judge one another, or by your abilities and what you bring to a team, whether it's an infantry platoon or a corporation or an academic department or a construction company. They're also being told that, hey, you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, right? They're also being told that they cannot empathize with one another anymore. Really, because if you are not in a certain identity category, you can no longer really understand even, the experience of others. I mean, how long is it going to take before the younger generation rejects that and says, no, that's really not an ideology for me? And are you finding a receptive audiences among students? Because that's another way maybe to reform academic institutions is for the students as well as the parents to demand better.
And there's a lot of students hungry for that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, I hear, as you guys can imagine, from the dissident students or the closeted students. Those are the people that write me. They're overwhelmingly liberal and progressive, but they just think that this ideology is what it is, which is retrograde. Often, though, they're very scared to speak out about it. Why? Because they're also ambitious. And because right now, just think about it this way, okay? If you exit the legacy press, things have changed in the past 6 months with Substack and Patreon and podcasting. But in general, if you exit the world of the New York Times, what you get inside of the world of the New York Times is MacArthur Awards, Guggenheim Awards, Pulitzer Prizes, invitations to Aspen, invitations to, whatever fancy things, good tables at restaurants, not for nothing, book deals, and speaking circuit, and invitations on MSNBC and CNN every single night. You exit it. What do you get? I'll speak from my personal experience. You maybe get to keep your book contract. From now on, though, you're probably going to have to go to Regnery, and you get invited on Fox News. That's a very bad bargain for a young person. Like, let's just say the average journalist, but the same thing applies to lots of other places. So we need to make exit easier. And the way that we make exit easier is by giving people, and this is what I want to be doing, the newsletter on Substack being only the beginning of it, creating a new world where people can live in, and a world that's not just reactionary to woke, but a world that's just not woke, a world that's just perpendicular to all of this. I'm not interested in spending my life or the next 10 years of my life standing with a few people on a beach trying to punch back against a tsunami. I'd rather just go down the beach and make a better party that people want to go to. If you go and I'm kind of a magazine nerd and look back at old Vogues and Vanity Fairs and, Spy and the rest from the 90s, you're like, that's a party I want to go to. You can't find any joy, any sense of a different sound when you pick up. I used to be so excited when I would get a new New Yorker, 15 years ago. Now I'm like, I don't even need to read it. I already know what's in it. I already know what it's going to sound like. Same thing with NPR, same thing with all of these places I used to listen to and love and envy and trust. And so the question now is, how do we build new things that stoke that kind of feeling in us? And right now, I think we are starting on that path. And certainly we have new organizations that are trying to fight it, which is necessary. But I think the real killer of this ideology will be when people have an alternative world that they can go to that's more exciting and attractive to them right now than the legacy one is.
And helps them feel pride.
Yes.
Proud of who we are as a people and our society in one another. I'm reminded of Richard Rorty's old observation that that pride is to nations like self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement. And I think we have a real deficit of pride these days. And what's reinforcing, I think, this the polarization of our society associated with this interaction, I think, between critical race theory on one extreme and white supremacist people and racists on another extreme. They feed on each other. They pull us apart from one another, and that combined with the way we teach our history, I think, has resulted in a real crisis of national pride.
HR, here, I think the military has great lessons for us, which you've been kind enough to say. One, you guys know how to define and instill a culture. The military did an amazing thing on race relations starting in the 1950s. You will not be racist in this organization, just way ahead of the rest of the society. And you know how to define pride. You know how to define a culture, which is other institutions seem to, whatever you guys come in with, well, fine, that's the way it is, as opposed to defining an institutional culture. And in a hopeful note, I did just see this morning that ratings on some of the CNN and MSNBC, now that Trump is gone, the outrage ratings are just plummeting. So maybe we'll get back to being able to read interesting things like John McPhee in the New Yorker, stuff we love about geology on Route 80 and not just, Trump.
Well, it is a kind of good news question, because one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that you, Andrew Sullivan, Matt Taibbi, a whole bunch of writers, Matty Iglesias, very much a writer on the left, have all in your various ways ended up writing through Substack. And for those who don't know, this means that you're essentially selling your content direct to the readers. The readers subscribe, and I do subscribe to you, Bari, and to the other authors I just mentioned. And according to a very bright man named Ben Thompson, who writes the Stratechery blog, you guys are all making more money than you ever did before, because there is, in fact, a huge demand for quality writing. And this just made me so cheered up that, in fact, just going straight to the consumer through what is in effect the kind of platform of Substack, it works. So when you go to that other beach to have that party, there's a whole bunch of the most interesting writers in the world, and you have more money to spend on the drink. So please invite me to the party.
You're invited.
So we started with the internet as
that is, it's true. It's been incredible. I mean, I joined 8 weeks ago now, and it's going really wonderfully. And I'm spending some of that money to pay writers as guest posters, much more than I could ever pay them at the Times with the op-ed budget. So I think that that's really fantastic. What I'll say is that right now I'm paying way more in newsletter and podcast subscriptions than I am for the Wall Street Journal to come to my house every day. So at some point, and this is what I'm really, really interested in, for those of us who are nerds, who live a lot of our life on the internet, which I imagine is the GoodFellows exempting HR, of course, it's easy, right? We know who to follow. We're on Twitter, blah, blah, blah. No. For the average dentist or accountant or someone like my parents who are really intelligent, but are like, what's Substack again? What's Patreon? We need to make it easier, I think, for the average American. So I'm really interested in sort of curating the world of the outsider intellectuals, the people that are speaking, I would say, for the rest of us, because I feel increasingly that the legacy press is speaking to the tiniest sliver of American life. And the group that I think of as sort of the self-silencing majority, some of whom I would say, John, are posing as true believers, but aren't actually true believers and are desperate for an alternative. I want to give them that alternative.
I can't cancel you guys as the moderator, but I can bring this to a halt. So let's wrap up the show with one last question, and it's this. I don't know if we've solved the question of whether or not cancel culture is McCarthyism, if it's a fever we're undergoing, or if it's a cancer that's here and needs to be cured long-term. But I do know this, deferring to my historian friends, McCarthyism, the tipping point for McCarthyism is when someone has the nerve to confront Joseph McCarthy and say, have you no decency? So the question to Bari and the GoodFellows is this. Is there such a thing as a tipping point for cancel culture? What is the equivalent to somebody saying, have you no decency, and moving away from this mentality?
Well, I'll go first, because in a way it's a historical question. The answer is that you think it's going to come much sooner than it does.
Right.
If this is the French Revolution, I'm afraid it's probably only 1790. The moment of truth in the French Revolution was when Robespierre himself was guillotined. But remember, the French Revolution, even after that, did not exactly take France back to whatever liberal principles the revolution had begun with. The worrying thing for me is that the Great Awakening or the Cultural Revolution has some way to go. And it's very hard to see how you turn the tide as institution after institution accepts the new totalitarianism from below. So I don't think this is McCarthyism. Looking back on it, McCarthyism was quite short-lived, and it was quite easy to call his bluff in the end, even although he actually wasn't fantasizing that there were card-carrying communists in the US government. But this is not McCarthyism, and this will be much, much harder to get to a tipping point. It may take years.
Okay, HR?
Well, the question you mentioned was aimed at McCarthy, right? Have you decency? I think maybe the tipping point is a question that we aim at the audience of those who peddle critical race theory, for example. And the simple question I think to ask is, do you really believe that you should really evaluate others, judge others by their identity category rather than by their character and their ability and what they can bring to whatever enterprise or whatever community that you're part of? And so I think we need to make a case for, again, color blindness, tolerance, empathy for one another, and that positive case and that simple question, I think can maybe be a tipping point.
I'm of a darker mood. HR is always the optimistic guy. McCarthy was one guy. This isn't one guy. This is a political / religious movement, like, say, the Protestant Reformation, which was not that pleasant if you look at the body count, designed to seize and keep power in the name of some vaguely defined utopia. To HR's point, the more ridiculous the ideology, the better. When forced to stand up and pledge, Maoist ideology or Marxist-Leninism, it's a sign of forcing people to stand up and say ridiculous things that says, I'm in the team here. And these things end into we are the beginnings of a counter-revolution is there, as we've talked about. There are hopefully new institutions to fight back. But these things end, I'll play amateur historian, in exhaustion or the discovery of an external threat. The Protestant Reformation ended 30 years later. I'll get the numbers wrong and Neil will kill me for it, in exhaustion, or when a society discovers an external threat, the need to be effective, to be competitive, that we don't have time for this sort of stuff. And so that view says there's a long way to go.
Hey, Barry, I'll give you the final word.
Well, I would imagine that it's a topic for another conversation, that external threat is here in the form of China. But that's a conversation.
We're not serious about it yet, though, right?
Maybe you'll have me on GoodFellows again. Look, I would say that one thing that gives me a lot of strength and, whatever courage I'm able to exhibit in my life is the fact that all the good people, all the people that I really admire, even though we don't have the numbers, we have the quality. And just to give a shout out to Ayan, she was the first person that I spoke to after I think it was right when I sent the letter, right when I decided to leave the Times. And I have to be honest that I was a mess. Like, I was emotionally blacked out. And the first thing she said to me was, do you need a job? I'll hire you tomorrow. And that is the kind of solidarity that I think that those of us who are on the side of reason, of enlightenment principles, of empathy, on a vision of America and Americanism that insists on our common humanity over what makes us different, need to be giving each other that kind of strength and solidarity and that's that sense of strength and solidarity. And I have to say, it was really exciting to tell people that I worked at the New York Times. I remember when I got the job, I called my grandparents, who, as I mentioned, have been lifelong subscribers, and they were crying. But I haven't regretted leaving for a single second. And I find that this life, let's call it the building a life on the outside and building a new world on the outside, is much, much more meaningful. It's maybe a little less glossy and a little less fancy, at least to start, but I find it to be incredibly meaningful. And so if you're listening to this and you're a young person and you're wondering, what life might look like for you if you decide to make the choice of exit, I will simply say that the party is growing by the day, and that there's some really, really not just smart, but wise and loyal people out here.
Let's do one other thing. If you're listening to this, sign up for Bari's great newsletter on Substack, and it's called Common Sense with Bari Weiss. And the address for that is barryweiss.substack.com. Let me repeat that, barryweiss.substack.com. While you're at it, go to Amazon and get her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. HR mentioned that. You can also get Niall Ferguson's Doom while you're there. You can get HR's Battlegrounds as well. Make it a trifecta, if you will. So that's it for this episode of GoodFellows this week. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We'll be back next week with a new topic. On behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, HR McMaster, John Cochrane, our very special guest today, Bari Weiss. Thanks for joining us. By all means, stay safe, stay healthy. We will do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.